Welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis. It's great to be with you here today. Today on the show, we've got a great guest, a guest who's really impacted me. I read her work, Total Truth, back in 2012, I believe, and that just really began to shape how I thought about things and really kind of like changed a lot of the ways I think about things too. So if you haven't read Total Truth, go read that. But today on the show, we've got Professor Nancy Pearcey down at Houston Christian University. She's the professor of apologetics. We had her out to our church up in Denver to speak on her prior book, Love Thy Body, with great presentation, packed house for that, very important topic. But today we wanted to talk about the toxic war on masculinity, her latest work. So Nancy, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's good to see you again.
Great to see you too. Let's get into the topic of toxic masculinity. This is something I have heard about, I've read about. I started noticing it on NPR, and when I was still listening to that at the time. But I noticed the way they talked about men, and I was like, I think they hate me. And I saw these articles coming out like, is it okay to kill men or something like this? And I'm like, this is insane. And so you say that these criticisms of men came out much earlier than most of us think. This isn't just a last decade conversation. Where did this idea of toxic masculinity come from?
Yes, well, it caught my eye just like it did yours. When I saw titles like the Washington Post had an article titled "Why Can't We Hate Men?" and I thought, really, in a respected mainstream publication. And the "Kill All Men" was from a Huffington Post editor. She tweeted hashtag "Kill All Men," and you could buy T-shirts that say "So many men, so little ammunition." And books with titles like "I Hate Men," "No Good Men," and "Are Men Necessary?" So this is what made me think I need to address this. And even male writers are getting on the bandwagon. A book by a male author said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. And you may have seen this one too, because it was in the news. The director of the movie Avatar,
Yeah,
you
I saw
see
that.
that,
Yeah.
where he said testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of people assume that this is sort of from the 1960s, right, out of second wave feminism. But what surprised me when I began to research it was it started in the 19th century, much farther back than most of us realize. And the setting was this. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, men worked side by side with their wives and children all day on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And as a result, the cultural expectation on men was very much a caretaking role. The person who was responsible for the common good of the family. In fact, that's what the meaning of authority was back then. They had a very definite meaning of authority, and it meant the person responsible for the common good of the marriage, of the family, of the church, the school, civil society, and so on. The person in authority was not supposed to look out for his own interest. He was supposed to look out for the interest of the whole. And this tragedy is we've kind of lost that notion, and it started with the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution took work out of the home, and of course, men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time, American men were no longer working with people that they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they are working as an individual in competition with other men. And this is where you start to see the literature change. People began to lament, to complain, to protest that men were losing that caretaking ethos that they had in the colonial era, that they were becoming self-interested and aggressive and ambitious and look out for number one, win at all costs, etc. And you see it in the literature of the day that people began to say, well, let's put it this way. It was the first time that the male character began to be defined in negative terms. And people didn't like it, but they said men are changing. And so if we want to really understand where the notion comes from that the male character is somehow, dangerous and evil, we have to go all the way back to the 19th century. That's when it begins. You can't really oppose a social trend unless you ask, where did it come from and how did it develop? And so that's what I do in my book.
Yeah, and a fantastic job, by the way. Very well researched. If you're looking for a book, I was delighted to see so much references to the Puritans and their writings. So just personally, that was great. But this is an important topic. I mean, we've shown a documentary, or at least we've shared it at our church, Even Exile, which kind of goes into the different waves of feminism. Me and some of our elders here at the church are reading Masculine Christianity by Zach Garris. He also gets into the history of feminism in the 19th century. So it's a very important topic, and your work contributes greatly to the discourse on these matters. One of the things that's interesting for men today is there's a crisis of masculinity going on, which you may not know about if you just listen to the mainstream kind of narratives that are sold. But there truly is. Men don't know how to operate. They don't know their role. They've been told they should hate themselves or get rid of their testosterone and all this kind of stuff. And so there's kind of two competing scripts for masculinity. Can you explain what those are and how they came about?
Yeah, this was fascinating, and I'll give you some of the background that's not in the book. Has turned out to be the most controversial book I've written, which surprised me because my last book, Love Thy Body, was on issues like abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, and people say it's more relevant now than when I wrote it. But this one has been even more controversial. And I ran a lot of classes and reading groups on it to sort of catch all the rough edges. And when they told their family and friends about the book, invariably the first question was, whose side is she on? With that tone, whose side is she on? And the assumption seemed to be, well, men seemed to assume I was a male bashing feminist. And others said, well, thought maybe I was some kind of angry reactionary. And by the way, the second question was always, and why is a woman writing a book on masculinity anyway? And so what I did is there's a study that helps kind of diffuse that. And so I put it right at the beginning of the book. It was later, and I moved it to the front because it's done by a sociologist. He's not a Christian, but he's very well known. And so he speaks all around the world. And he came up with this clever experiment where he asked young men two questions. He says, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy, they say he was a good man. What does that mean? And the sociologist said, all around the globe, young men had no problem answering that question. They would say things like honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, be a provider, be a protector, be responsible, be generous. And he would say, well, where'd you learn that? And they'd say, well, it's just in the air we breathe. Or if they were in a Western country, they would say, it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. So then he would follow up with a second question. He'd say, what if I said to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men would say, oh, no, that's completely different. And they would define it in words like this. That means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language. Mm-hmm. And so what this sociologist concluded is that all around the globe, he was doing these studies from Brazil to Sweden to Australia. So all around the globe, men do have an innate, inherent knowledge of what it means to be a good man. And as we would say, they're made in God's image. So yes, of course they understand what it means to be a good man. Romans 2, we all have a conscience. But in many cases, they live in cultures that pressure them to be the real man, quote unquote, which does include traits that we might consider more toxic. And certainly if it's disconnected from the moral ideal of the good man, it can slide into entitlement, dominance, control, and so on. And so this was fascinating because, first of all, it means we're not defending masculinity or attacking it wholesale. We can say, the good man is like the young men said, part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. That is the Christian ethic, the biblical view of manhood. But we can critique the quote-unquote real man and show that it doesn't fit the biblical standard. And it also suggests a better way, I think, of dealing with these issues because men do not respond well to being called toxic. Nobody would. So a better strategy is, can we tap into their innate knowledge of what it means to be the good man, to their innate moral sense, to their and affirm and support and encourage that side of them? That gives us a much more positive way to approach these issues.
Yeah, it seems like it's hard to do nowadays with a lot of people not having maybe an innate moral sense. And as our culture kind of moves away from that, they're looking to figures such as Joe Rogan, Andrew Tate, or these other kind of cultural influencers. And some of those, not Andrew Tate, but some of those I've listened to. Jordan Peterson, for example, when I read his work, that was extremely helpful for me. Even in the last few years, to just, oh wow, this is like striking a chord with me that most pastors aren't hitting on. One of the topics that you bring up in chapter 6, and it's something I've wrestled with really my whole life in Christianity and being a good man, is this idea of being a servant leader. I was pretty bought into this idea of being a servant leader. It's pretty much everywhere in Christianity. The reason it became a problem for me is it became an excuse to shirk responsibility in headship in the home and in other places. And it kind of led to this happy wife, happy life attitude, where a lot of men feel like servant leader means just be a doormat for your wife and keep her happy. So how are we to conceive of servant leadership? Obviously, when I've questioned this with other pastors, they're like, "You're questioning Jesus Christ himself." And I'm like, "I'm not. I know Jesus washed people's feet. I know Jesus was a servant. I know that." But it's kind of in what I'm seeing in a lot of Christian culture, it's become kind of this way of describing leadership that's very soft, and has a very feminist appeal, in the sense that, like, it's kind of like demurring kind of the strength, the virtue, the protecting, the providing, and it morphs into a kind of like, well, as long as my wife's happy, that I've been a godly man. Have you seen that play out, and how do you address that in the book?
Yeah, I've seen it very recently. Uh, I'm trying to think which part of the book I should start with. Let me explain what I do in the book. It's the most fact-based book I've ever written. Love Thy Body was more philosophical and moral arguments and so on. Whereas this one, I go through the facts of history, which we mentioned a moment ago, and then I go through the facts of sociology. And so I don't myself say, well, here's my position and I'm going to defend it. Instead, I wanted to see how Christian men actually do live out their understanding of masculinity. And the reason is that the secular culture is attacking Christian men. So I'm an apologist at heart, right? So my main interest is, what is the secular culture saying and how do we defend against it? So the secular culture certainly treats evangelical men as any notion of headship is going to turn them into overbearing, domineering, tyrannical patriarchs. And it was very easy to find examples. A quick Google search, and I'll give you just one. So this was the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which was a follow-up to the Me Too movement. And she said the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. So what happened is Christian sociologists and psychologists were reading these accusations and saying, well, where's your evidence? You're making these accusations, but where's your data? So they went out and did the studies. They said, well, let's see if evangelical theology actually turns men into these overbearing tyrants. And they discovered the exact opposite. And this was very exciting to me. I mean, it blew me away because, of course, I was reading these accusations too. And so when I read the actual surveys talking to Christian men, I was blown away by how loving and respectful their understanding of headship was. And in fact, Christian men evangelical Christian men, theologically conservative, test out as being the most loving husbands and the most engaged fathers. And by the way, the first pushback I often get is, oh, yeah, of course their wives said they were happy. The husband's sitting right next to them. The answer is no. These were done on very large objective databases where women were asked questions separately. And so what they're really saying is that the wives reported a highest level of happiness with their husband's love and affection. Evangelical fathers are the most engaged with their children, both in terms of shared activities like sports and church youth group, and in terms of discipline, like setting limits on screen time or enforcing bedtime. Evangelical couples are the least likely to divorce. And the real surprise was they have the lowest rates of domestic violence of any major group in America. So it completely debunks the secular narrative, the media stories that we get all the time. And so this was my main interest was, how do we defend Christian men against secular accusations? And they come out very well. It's surprisingly well. I mean, most Christians don't know this. They don't know that Christian men are doing so well. And this is why this was the final reason I decided to write the book, in fact, because I had to go digging in the academic literature to find this. I read a lot of academic journals in order to find these studies. It's not out there in the public yet. And so I wanted to bring it to the public for two reasons. One, to encourage men in the church. The church should be encouraging men that they're doing a good job. I have one of my graduate students was the ministry, the head of the women's ministry at a very large Baptist church, and she said, on Mother's Day we hand out roses and tell mothers they're wonderful. On Father's Day we scold men and tell them to do better. And churches need to stop that.
Yeah.
Christian evangelical men are doing very well. So I think that's part of my goal, is to help encourage Christian men. And because Christian men are as beaten down as the rest of American men, when I told my class I was writing a book on masculinity, one of my male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." Mm. Okay, we need this. And then, of course, I also want to encourage people to bring this out into the public square. This is not just rah language, from some Christian leader. This is hard empirical data. This is evidence-based research showing that Christian men actually do very well compared to the rest of American culture.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that comes up related to the question in your answer is how men and women relate in their spirituality. And so in the 19th century, you highlight how a lot of the revivalist movements and other matters, as men moved away from the home, women were seen as kind of this more spiritual entity, and men were kind of this barbaric. And you tie it in well to the sacred secular split, which, if you're a listener and you haven't read, go read Total Truth, and it's really helpful on that matter. But you tie that in on this matter with a few authors. You highlight how they've written on masculinity such that, like, a woman is designed to civilize a man. One guy, I think his name is George Gilder, has written on this. And so how do we understand how that came up, and how do we combat it? How do we help men understand, one, they're not barbaric? How do we help women understand their job is not to civilize men? How do we equip the church on this matter?
Yeah, again, it's helpful to go back and see where this started. After the Industrial Revolution, when men had to leave the home and they were no longer as closely connected to their family, they did develop that sacred secular split. As factories developed, and commerce, and large financial institutions and universities, and of course the state increases, there became this large public sphere. And people began to say, in the public sphere, these large institutions should operate by scientific principles, by which they meant value-free. Just like today, we're told, don't bring your private values into the public realm. That's when that started. But if values were not in the public realm, they were relegated to the private realm, where the home and the family, where women were still in the home back then. They weren't in the workplace at all. So values, morality, spirituality became more associated with women. And women were starting to be held up as the moral guardians of society. And I have to press upon you how unique this was. Never before in human history had women been said to be morally or spiritually superior to men. All the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, people had thought that the insight into right and wrong was a rational insight, and they thought men were more rational, and therefore men were more virtuous. In fact, the word virtue, the root of it, vir, is Latin for man, as in the word virile. So virtue, the very term, had overtones of manly strength and honor. And it was only in the 19th century that there was this huge reversal. It was dramatic that suddenly women were seen as more moral and more spiritual. And men were supposed to come home from the dog-eat-dog secular realm of, business and commerce, come home to their wives and be reformed and renewed and refined by their morally superior wives. And of course, men therefore were straddling that sacred secular split that you mentioned. They were, the way they coped, many of them, was to essentially think like a secular person in the workplace, and then come home and transfer back into thinking like a Christian, which of course didn't work. And you actually see this in the literature of the time as well. I love looking at how people thought back then. You see people complaining that our men are becoming split in half, which is not tenable. And of course, as a result, men ultimately became more secular. And that's where the concept developed that it's up to women to tame these men. That men men are just naturally more lewd, rude, and crude. More secular, less religious, less spiritual. They started going to church less. They started being less committed to biblical moral standards, and so on. But the real, an important turning point, if I can keep going, because I think you have a question later about Darwin, right? So that was an important turning point in terms of seeing men as actually barbaric. Darwinian thinkers began to say that the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival were by necessity would be ruthless, rugged, barbarian, savage, and even predatory. And so they began to say, if you want to recover your authentic manhood, you need to recover the animal within, the beast within. This is when, for example, the Tarzan books became very popular. And he was intentionally writing to show, his son writes this, by the way, his son explains it, says that his father was writing the Tarzan books explicitly to show that that humans are part of the animal world. And so even after Tarzan, so the idea, right, he's raised by the apes, so he still retains that inner wildness. And even after he learns European customs and languages, he turns to Jane and says, I'm still a wild beast at heart. And so and there was more serious literature too. There's a whole genre called literary naturalism that was also fiction that was explicitly intended to teach a Darwinian worldview. The best known would be Jack London. Right. So when he was a young man, he read Darwinian literature and had what one historian calls a conversion experience to radical naturalism or materialism. He read Charles Darwin enough that he memorized passages from Darwin's books the way Christians memorize scripture. So he wrote about dogs, mostly, but they were metaphors for humans. And his whole point was we're just products of evolution, natural selection, genes and environment, and so on. And so all of this, as a result, Darwinism had a particularly strong impact on developing a more secular script for masculinity, that men are naturally barbarian and wild and uncivilized. By the way, you wonder then how women got along with them. Herbert Spencer was the main popularizer of Darwinism in America, and he addressed that question. He said, well, men are so brutal that women had to develop the ability to please. And then he added, it would also help if they learned to hide their resentment at such poor treatment. So that was apparently the message of evolution. Men are brutal beasts, and women need to please and placate them. So instead of urging men to live up to the image of God in them, Darwinian thinkers said, no, you find your true selfhood by living down to the animal within, getting in touch with the beast within, under their favorite phrase was, under a thin veneer of civilization. But yes, and as a result, it was the idea that I have a chapter on Darwinism, but I do bring it up to today because you mentioned George Gilder. So it has been revived in our own day under the social Darwinism. It used to be called social Darwinism, the application of Darwin to social issues. And it was discredited. So it's been brought back under the label of evolutionary psychology. And evolutionary psychologists have, if anything, driven that same script even further. There's a best-selling book called The Moral Animal that says the human male is a flesh-obsessed, possessive pig pig, a flesh-obsessed pig. Trying to tell men how to have a good marriage is like giving Vikings a free booklet on how not to pillage. I thought, you really? People are reading this book? It's a best-selling book. And then George Gilder, who also is an evolutionary psychologist, uses, I think, even if anything, even more explicit language, saying that men are just naturally uncivilized, prone to crime, irresponsible, drug addicted, and it's up to women to tame them. It's up to women to civilize them. So it is a big part of the secular script today that men are just naturally, beasts and barbarians, and it's up to women to tame them. And I think we saw that in the Me Too movement. I mean, right? Men were painted as just naturally more prone to sin and vice, especially sexual sin, and it's up to women to call them to task. And you might find this interesting, Chase. I was interviewed by a young couple that runs a podcast a couple of weeks ago, and so I asked them about it, and they said, "Oh, it's for young people at least." They said it's very much part of what we hear in churches as well. That boys, like in the dating scene, the boys will always push on the sexual level. They'll always push for more. They're naturally lustful. They're naturally prone to watch porn, and it's women who need to be the gatekeepers. It's women who need to draw the line. So I think that it's also, there's a Christian version of this, which seems to be still prominent in the Christian church.
No, I've seen it too, and as we mentioned the word wild, it reminded me of a book in high school I read called Wild at Heart, which we've had men at our church read it, and it's been useful for them. And I don't necessarily have much about that. I should probably go back and read it now, 20 years later. But it does kind of tap into that same kind of ethos, and there's something in it that they're touching on some kind of truth in there, but really they're overreaching, because men are more naturally aggressive, assertive, testosterone, just biologically. But they devalue men in doing that, and then hold up women as kind of these saviors who have to come in and save men. Would you say that's a fair representation?
Yes, I do. One of the things I did have to put in the chapter 1, because I always got questions of, well, what do you think are the differences between men and women then? And I thought the safest place to start is sheer biology, like you said. Men are bigger, stronger, faster. And because of testosterone, they do tend to be more aggressive, more risk-taking. And we should acknowledge those differences. We should welcome them. This is how God made men. And so we want to be supportive of the basic male character as God made it. I got an email just a few days ago from a man, and he said, "Your book made me proud to be a man." I thought, that's one of the highest praise I think I've ever gotten. So I do encourage readers to value men, and what is good men are a gift to women. And of course, the only reason that feminists and others are often kind of hypersensitive about saying that there's any differences between men and women, it's because as soon as you say there's a difference, almost invariably one's going to be less than. So the other side of it is we do need to say that the distinctively feminine traits are also strengths. They're not weaknesses. And you mentioned Jordan Peterson. He does a really good job of this. He says, caring for a newborn is extremely rigorous. You have to be on call 24 hours a day. You have to be willing to be interrupted no matter what you're doing. If it's 3 a.m. in the morning, you have to be extraordinarily sensitive to nonverbal cues, because they're not talking yet. You have to be incredibly patient. If a child is in distress in those early years, you don't reason with them. You don't scold them. You meet their distress. And of course, women also become very sensitive to threats in their environment. They become mama bears. And so I thought that was a good way of keeping the balance. We want to say that the way God created men, masculinity is inherently good. But we have to be careful, because in our culture, we do have a history, until the 19th century, we do have a history of women often being seen as less than. So I think it's also equally important to say that women's traits are also strengths. They're not weaknesses; they are also strengths.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. It's something we, I mean, uh, took advantage of on Mother's Day and Father's Day this year, trying to highlight both the strengths of each individual. You know, what does it mean to be a strong, godly woman who is, submissive according to God's word? What does it mean to be a strong, godly man who is, operating with authority that's appropriate biblically, not domineering, not abrasive, not abusive, none of that, but just embracing who God made you to be. One of the things that I've sensed in my own sanctification, just things I was raised with, is that, and it this really hit a tipping point for me and my family in 2020. And I was reading Aaron Rand and some other people, and that's why I mentioned servant leadership earlier, because it felt like the script for a lot of men in churches, the virtue and the sanctification, the goal was androgyny. The goal was to become, if it wasn't to become the same, for men it was to become more like a woman. And so you see this with a lot of young men, where if they're more either sensitive or whatever they may be, they're actually kind of encouraged to go into ministry because they're more like motherly, they're more caretaking, they're more whatever. And so then the seminaries themselves kind of actually sometimes reinforce that. Seminaries don't really have a differentiation between men and women in ministry, and so there's this melding and androgynous view of pastoral authority, the pulpit, and what means to be a man. What could it look like for churches and for seminaries to help men be better men today?
Yeah, that's a little tricky because they do have to stand against the more typical male weaknesses or vices. I mean, both sexes have their own distinctive weaknesses as well. And I think because men are just naturally stronger, um, it is true that often people will say, well, you have a greater responsibility to harness your strength and to channel it into uh, caretaking and productive roles, honorable roles. And so that often can come across as, pull in, pull in your strengths instead of affirming them. Um, and in my book, I do quote one historian that was very interesting. He's not a Christian, and he talks about the distinctions between Christianity and other religions. He says your view of manhood tends to reflect your view of God. And so he starts with polytheism. He says polytheism is the worship of many gods, right? So the Greek gods or the Norse gods. And he says, here's how he puts it: the gods drank, they wenched, they fought, they championed military power. So polytheism tends to lead to the real man is a warrior, the heroic virtues. And there's some truth to that. But it is incomplete. So then he goes on to monotheism. And he starts with monotheism, where God is so transcendent that he has no relationship really with the creation, and which is mostly Islam. In fact, I found an Islamic writer who said the very idea that Allah would condescend to have a personal relationship with mere mortals um, would be demeaning to God. So that form of that understanding of God leads to the emphasis on authority and power. And there's some truth to that. Then this historian goes on to Judaism, because Judaism is monotheistic, but God does have a relationship with his people, a covenant relationship. And so the real man is the loving father. Then Christianity arises from within Judaism, and this secular historian said, and that complexified everything. Because Jesus comes in, and of course he does not deny the loving father part, but he does bring in the servant leadership part, which which even this non-Christian historian mentions. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that Christianity was the only one that sort of brought that balance then of gentleness, love, compassion, being masculine virtues, not being, not asking men to be effeminate, but being in fact masculine virtues. And he comments on how Christianity is the only religion that encourages men to exercise what previously had been stereotypically thought to be feminine virtues. So it's interesting that that Christianity calls men to be both tough and tender, both courageous and compassionate, to image the whole image, to live out the whole image of God as whole persons. And I think that's where we want to try to capture, is what is that vision of the whole person, so that we're not imbalanced either direction. Because I agree with you. This was one of the things I ran into when I was researching for my book, by the way. I felt like so many of the books said men would be better if they would only be more feminine.
Yeah.
and I really, so I was very aware of that when I was writing. I was very careful not to imply that.
Yeah, and that's something, that's a script that a lot of men have embraced, or at least I've seen in other pastors, and that's a hard conversation to have. You don't typically lead, hey pastor, you're awfully effeminate. Although Charles Spurgeon, said that kind of thing, but that's a very interesting topic that deserves further exploration today. What would it look like for seminaries to train pastors, and pastors are men, to be tough, and do so biblically, like King Jesus? One of the things that really piques my interest is this thing that I've been noticing with people in my kind of age group, guys in my age group, is they read your book. Let's say they read your book, or they're reading Jordan Peterson, or they're, whoever it is they're listening to. They're starting to embrace more masculine virtue, and yet their whole marriage has not been based on that, and they're married to a wife who's not reading the same literature, and both of them have grown up in a very feminized culture. They've gone to a secular college, not a Christian college, and so they're naturally just kind of inculcated with feminism. How can a man start that conversation with a wife so that it can go well, without just kind of going off not the deep end, but becoming kind of this, like, I don't care about you, I don't care what you have to say, you're emotional, becoming abrasive and a brute? How can he help his wife come along with him in that journey, rather than just kind of like either repressing it and not telling her, like, hey, I'm reading all this literature and it's really changing the way I perceive myself, and I want to be a godly man, and I want to take more responsibility around here. How can that go well?
Yeah, I thought that was a fascinating question when you wrote it to me before the interview. Because I used to be a very strong feminist. As I explained in the introduction to my book, I grew up in a very abusive home. My father was very abusive, and so the natural reaction is, for years and years, I read only feminist literature. I always had some feminist book on my bedside table. And so I really, when you asked that question, I started thinking, well, how did I change? and I have two answers for you. One is, I personally changed when I got tired of being a victim. All the feminists, I can remember the exact day. I was reading Nancy Friday's book, My Mother, Myself. And if you had problem X, it was because your mom mistreated you. If you had problem Y, it was because your mom mistreated you. And I finally put the book down and said, I'm tired of being a victim. That was the day I stopped calling myself a feminist.
Okay.
But for men, the part of my book that might be the most interesting is you have to get to the chapters on domestic violence, because if we haven't mentioned this yet, but we should, for balance. When we talked about evangelical men testing out as the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers, the pushback you always get is, but wait a minute, haven't we always heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as everyone else? And so the researchers went back to the data, and they separated out the Christian men who really live it out, who are committed, who attend church regularly, from nominal Christians, who in a survey like this might check the Baptist box, for example, but who don't attend church, or rarely, if at all. And they test out as dramatically different. They do test out with all the toxic traits. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They are the least engaged with their kids. They have the highest rate of divorce, higher than secular men. And they have the highest rate of domestic violence and abuse of any group in America. So this is why the statistics get so skewed, because you've got men who are better than secular men, and you have men that are worse than secular men. One of the most helpful resources I found was a psychologist named John Gottman. He's considered perhaps the top marriage researcher, psychologist in the nation. He was a mathematician before he became a psychologist, and so he's very into quantifying things. And he became known. He brings people into a laboratory to spend up to 72 hours It's outfitted like a bed and breakfast, and he wires them up so that he tests their heart rate and their breathing rate and their sweat rate and their stress hormones and so on. And he has quantifiable descriptions of gestures like rolling your eyes in disgust, as well as everything you say. The point is that he puts all this into a computer and has become famous because he can predict with 93.6 accuracy which couples will divorce after observing them for about 15 minutes. So that's how he became famous. But what he does in his research, what he found is that men actually have the greatest impact on whether they have a successful marriage or not. And I thought this was incredibly empowering, because what he discovered was that, well, it starts with maybe sounds a little bit negative, because what he found is that 65% of men do not actually respect their wives. They do not listen to them. They do not take their views into account in making decisions. His language was, they do not accept influence from their wives. 65% of men. And of course, when that happens, women do feel disrespected. And he said, if men do not share power with their wives, their marriage is 81% more likely to break up, either divorce or long-term unhappiness. But he says, I'm not saying this to shame or blame men. I'm saying this to help men realize how much power they in fact have to improve their marriage. Because after all, here's how he puts it. We all know it's primarily women who read books on marriage, read articles on marriage, go to therapists, seek pastoral advice on their marriages. So he says, whether their marriage works out depends primarily on whether men return the favor. That's his words again. Whether men also put the effort in. Their wives are putting the effort in. He says, unfortunately, too often men don't, but he's encouraging them to do so, because if women are already looking for ways to improve their marriage, it's whether men respond that makes it work or not. In one of his books, he actually turns to young men. It's directed to young men, and he says to them, men, I want you to realize how much power you have to have the successful marriage that you want. He says, men, not even a little bit. He says, by a large margin, men have the power by a large margin to determine whether their marriage turns out as a good marriage. And I thought ultimately that's incredibly encouraging. It is telling men that they do have the power to make their marriages better. And again, it's coming out of empirical, testable, quantifiable research. And so I hope that that message comes through in my book too, as I go through that research, that if men don't respond well, of course, they can ruin their marriage. That's the problem with having power, right? If you don't use your power well, that's on you. But if you do have that power and you recognize, I can in fact change my marriage, I think that's incredibly encouraging.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think, for any men listening, if that's you, if you're kind of listening to this and you're interested in these conversations and you never talked with your wife about it, I mean, the first thing to do is just start a conversation about it. Hey, I've been reading this book on marriage. It's really interesting. I'd love to talk about it. It's a really easy way to do it. I know that may be uncomfortable if you've never said that, but that's a biblically appropriate way to act like a man and take responsibility for your marriage. One more question, if you do have time. As far as I think I understand your book as, in the framing of it, is making an apologetic case for the biblical male, female, husband, wife. And so that helps me understand kind of who it's aimed at. When I've got people in the church, men I'm pastoring, one of the questions they have is like, okay, cool. I want to take responsibility. I want to lead. I want to be a better man in my home, a better husband. How do I do that? One of the things you mentioned in your book was spiritual leadership, which is important, and I agree with. But I was curious because it seems a little bit reductionistic in that, with the sacred secular split, we don't want to just reduce our relationship with our wives to merely the spiritual, the values component, but we want to get into that. And I know you may not want to get into the debates about headship, complementarianism, egalitarianism, all that kind of stuff. But I was just curious, What does it look like for a man if he wants to take more responsibility in his home? I mean, doing devotionals is great, like leading family worship, excellent. You do those things. What else might be opportunities that he's missing to take responsibility in his marriage in terms of leading his wife?
Yes, it was one of the things I found interesting in the research when I was looking at, okay, what do Christian men actually say they think headship means, right? I kind of stayed out of the complementarian egalitarian debate. And actually, I'll tell you one reason why. I explain in the book why. Um, One reason is that, according to the research, it doesn't seem to make that big of a difference what your gender theory is. So this was both Brad Wilcox, who's a sociologist. He said that in his research, he found that being family centered was the most important thing on whether you had a good marriage. If you think the family is the most important thing, it's the number one thing in your life, it's the foundation of society, and you're committed to this marriage. He found that that family centered outlook made a bigger difference in whether their wives were happy, um, than the gender theory. And by the way, let me give you a quote on that. It's sometimes fun to have it crystallized in a quote. So what he said is, your gender theory doesn't make as much difference as your commitment to family centered worldview. And to give you a sense of his stature, he gets published in the New York Times. So this was a New York Times article, and he wrote, "It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives," because they're looking at the wives, because the assumption is that evangelical men are oppressive. But the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. And then he turns to his secular colleagues. He's at the University of Virginia. So most of the other sociologists are secular, and he says academics need to cast aside their prejudices about religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular. Conservative Protestant married men with children are consistently the most active and expressive fathers and the most emotionally engaged husbands. So on the one hand, I really wanted to start with, what does bring out these excellent results. It's not your gender theory. It's whether you're committed to the family is the most important thing in your life. And he did do a study on egalitarian marriages, by the way, and said they're not any happier. They don't test out as any happier.
That's funny.
And then John Gottman, who I just mentioned, who's a non-Christian but who's a psychologist, and he puts it this way. He says, people coming into my practice sometimes believe that the man should be in charge of the home and the marriage, and then I get others who come in who are very egalitarian. And he says, you know what? It doesn't seem to matter. And this was his word. He said, emotionally intelligent husbands have figured out the most important thing, which is how to convey honor and respect to your wives. So I do these two quotes and I say, look, I'm not even entering into the debate over egalitarian, complementarian, because it doesn't seem to make that much difference in practice. And the second reason I didn't get into that debate is because that's not what these studies were. Most of the studies were not about that. They were looking at evangelicals, like, as you said a moment ago, they were responding to the secular critics. The secular critics were not getting into the weeds, the in-house debates over complementarian versus egalitarian. The secular critics are just looking at evangelicals and saying, you're bad, you're evil, you're oppressive. And so most of the studies actually were addressing that question. And I'm just reporting on the studies. And so I'm not going to get into things that the studies didn't cover. So anyway, that's my book is showing you the outcomes of the studies of evangelicals. And you're right. What was interesting about them is when you ask them what do you think headship means, most of them did not talk about breadwinner or even final decision maker, tiebreaker. They said spiritual leadership. And so they were asked, well, what does that mean? That was the most common phrase among evangelicals. And then when they were asked what that meant, most of them said, first of all, like you mentioned, very practical things: get your family to church on Sunday, have family devotions, take your kids to youth group. But they also mentioned the more intangible things, like feeling of sensing that you're responsible to nurture the spiritual life of your wife and children. And then addressing your question about the sacred secular split, um, I didn't get into it as much in this book, but yes, that includes training your kids on how to respond to an increasingly secular society. Are you training them to address the secular worldviews that they're going to be encountering in our society today? Are you equipping them to answer the challenges to their faith that they're going to encounter? So it does include training your kids on how they're going to respond to the wider society. And I think that's what kind of breaks it out of the sacred secular split.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, because it kind of gives us a bigger ownership and responsibility as men. Hey, the education of your children is your responsibility. It's not, you don't sub that out to your wife. It's like you, as a husband, like you need to take ownership over what they're watching, what they're reading, what they're learning, who their teachers are, all that kind of stuff. So I think that's really helpful. Well, Nancy, this was a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
It was fun. You're a great host. You're very conversational. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you. If you're interested in buying The Toxic War on Masculinity, you can go pick that up on Amazon. Is there anywhere else that people can go find that, Nancy?
Oh, certainly, just about anywhere you like to shop, christianbook.com. And also come to my website. I have a new website. My publisher gave me a brand new website with lots of very colorful and very fun. So come, you can browse my other books, and there's a contact form too. Send me a question or a comment. That would be fun.
That's great. Well, if you're listening,
I forgot to say what it is. NancyPearcey.com. That's so, it's so obvious, right? But NancyPearcey.com.
That's a great plug. Yeah, I always forget those simple things at the end of the podcast that I'm supposed to include. But yeah, NancyPearcey.com. I'll put that in the show notes for the listeners. I'll put a link to buy the book as well. And Nancy's very happy to hear from you. So if you have any questions about this podcast, just reach out to her on her website, head over there. And like I said, Nancy, this was great. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, if you're a listener and you enjoyed this episode, share it with somebody you know, someone you love. Have a great conversation with them. This is a really important topic. Men are in crisis, men need help, and we need to have good Christian answers from the world attacks the church and the Christian faith. And so this is going to be equipping for you. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you liked it enough to subscribe, do that, share it, give it a great rating. You can even sign up on the Patreon, and you can ask me questions about this episode on the Patreon. Head over there, sign up today. I'll put that in the show notes. Thanks so much for joining us today. We'll see you next time.